that'll help me out.
The entire month of April? What you doing there?
Well, we're launching our events in the U.S. this year, so we're starting with the 4 cities in Florida, and then in June we're doing Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville, and then in July we're doing Boston, Toronto, Montreal. Montreal we've already been doing for 2 years now. So
Man, you are all over. That's great.
yeah, definitely.
Well, let me get this launched here on. Do you have a actual PowerPoint you're going to share as well?
I do.
All right. I'll let you go ahead and press your share button and get that up on the screen there. I'm going to get this live on our closed Facebook group. And
awesome. Can you see it?
Yep, I can see it. Just make sure you put it on the presentation mode.
Absolutely.
Manage risk.
How's that?
That looks great. Looks great.
Awesome.
I'm going to press this to go live here. Got to tag you in it, of course. And we are good. All right. So we're live here with Nikolai Ray with the Multifamily Investor Nation Summit. This is at the 3:30 room 1. And if you're in if you're in the wrong room, you can go over to room 2. But if you're hopefully you want to stay in this room, of course, right? Because this is going to be a great session with Nikolai Ray. So we're having a little technical difficulty in room 2, I think, but that's okay. I'm going to get you started, and then I'll probably go over there and try to help them. But I want to do a introduction of Nikolai. I've been kind of seeing him all over social media and LinkedIn and various things like that, and I want to do an introduction. So Nikolai is the CEO of MREX, Multifamily Real Estate Exchange, and is recognized as one of the largest multifamily housing real estate experts in North Carolina, in North America. And MREX is a tech startup working on democratizing and unifying the multifamily real estate market. He also teaches multifamily financial engineering at the MREX College and is a keynote speaker at many industry events, including this one on here. So welcome to our session on multifamily, and welcome to the session that is all about managing risk in the multifamily real estate portfolio with Nikolai Ray. Nikolai, I'll turn it over to you, and I will be in the background in case you have any problems or issues, and then I'll also be the one moderating the questions as they come in throughout.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, hi, everyone. I hope everyone hears me well and everyone's doing well. Hopefully you're not in a place that's as cold as where I am right now, since I am currently in Quebec City, so a couple hours east of Montreal in the eastern part of Canada. And it's about, I guess, minus 40 right now with the wind chill factor. So I'm going to try and keep this nice and fiery, at least for myself. And for everyone else who's in a northern place or a cold place, same for you. And if you're in a southern place, well, then good for you. So today my presentation is about managing risk in multifamily real estate. I've been talking about risk in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months on my Facebook page, on my LinkedIn, and also in the various events that I've been speaking at, just because I think that we're at a really weird place right now with regards to the overall macroeconomy, and also with regards to the multifamily real estate market. Now, obviously, I want to make sure that everyone understands that, economics is not an exact science, and, we can have 10 economists come and present us data and their insights, and they might all have a different opinion on things. And to further make things even more complicated, the multifamily real estate space is a space that really lacks data and is extremely opaque. So the little data that's out there is actually of very poor quality, and usually the people who have decent data don't want to share it with other investors or other researchers or other professionals in the space. So right off the bat, it becomes very hard to truly pinpoint and establish things if we're comparing, for example, data sets in the stock market or in the foreign exchange market, where we have a lot more data and obviously more liquidity, which also gives more data too. Since multifamily properties usually transact once every 5 to 25 years, that also reduces the amount of data points that we can have in order to establish all our scientific research when it comes to markets and making the best investment decision possible. And on top of that, we kind of have to, as multifamily real estate investors, uh, think about the whole macro of things, and not only on the multifamily side, but on what's going on with the economy, both in the U.S. and in Canada, because each one has an effect on the other one, and also with regards to various things like capital markets, the stock market, and the bond market. These all have an effect on the multifamily market. So we have to consider this, and even today we have to consider what's going on globally as now our finance world is a lot more connected. You can see it in a lot of the 24-hour cities like LA and New York, and then the 18-hour cities like Miami and Chicago, and Dallas and Seattle, where more and more investors from Asia, from the Middle East, from Europe, and even actually from some African countries now are purchasing multifamily properties in these cities. Well, that really comes to affect the multifamily market as a whole with regards to the national level. But the other thing that we have to look at is also the multifamily level at the regional level, so at the metro area level, because obviously the multifamily market could actually at one point be doing very poorly, say at the national level, which is not the case right now. It's doing very well, but that doesn't stop it from actually doing well in certain specific markets. So that's always something you want to kind of keep in mind, that you kind of have to keep that high-low vision and high-low approach to investing in multifamily and looking at how the market's going. And obviously it makes things very complicated. So I'm going to try and keep things as real as possible today, not go too far in scientific jargon. I didn't put much data, and I didn't put much econometrics into my presentation, just because I know that most of the people in the rooms right now are either mom and pop investors or syndicators, and are not necessarily at the private equity level or the REIT level, which is one of the levels that I play a lot at, on top of the small cap, mid cap, multifamily investor level. So I'm going to try and keep it as real as possible, as useful as possible, because we could probably spend at least a couple days on this subject. So let's kind of dive down right into it. Just a brief introduction. Dan obviously introduced me earlier. So as he said, I'm the CEO of the MREX. The MREX is a tech startup. I can talk to you a bit more about it later on. Before that, I was actually the founder of an investment bank in multifamily, so a sort of boutique Goldman Sachs for the multifamily real estate investing world. Scaled that within 3 years to do over $100 million in transactions annually just on our own. So that was also a big learning experience, and helped me advance a lot as an expert in the space. So I have a mix of scientific and data background, with a lot of on the field, actually going into buildings and actually transacting buildings, looking at what can be done on the value add side, what can be done on the acquisition side, the negotiations and the due diligence and all that. So I'm a 4-time entrepreneur, so I've actually built 4 businesses. I exited 3 successfully, and 1 I absolutely completely fucked up. So I don't know if we're allowed to swear in this. I swear sometimes. So anyway, deal with it. I was also a 3-time Olympic coach. I studied biomechanics initially at university, and then preventive medicine. Obviously, was an ex-professional athlete in the sport of ice hockey. So in my 20s and early 30s, I actually also acted as an Olympic performance coach, helping Winter Olympic athletes perform better on the biomechanics side. So the whole biomechanics is obviously mathematics in motion, which has helped me a lot as a real estate investment financial engineer. So my expertise in multifamily real estate is particularly in financial engineering. I know that financial engineering is not something very well known in the multifamily space. What it is ultimately is manipulating mathematics, manipulating the effect of time on money, on the value of money, and playing with various capital stacks in order to make transactions work and make investments work in pretty much any type of environment. So it's extremely advanced as a science, as an art also, because there's quite an artistic side to it. It's very creative and ingenious. And I've started teaching it more and more to people, because I think it can help people, especially as multifamily becomes more and more sophisticated as it is right now. Financial engineering becomes a lot more apropos than say 20 years ago, when people were still just buying, a property and basing it off the price per unit or price per doors kind of methodology. So as more smart money gets into the market, as more money comes into the market, it becomes more competitive. And obviously, the internet has also made the market more sophisticated as we have more access to data and information. So that's what I specialize in. Market cycles also. I'm actually writing a book right now on market cycles in multifamily real estate. Capital raising, I've raised millions and millions of dollars, both on equity and debt. I worked a lot and still work a lot as advising LPs, high net worth individuals and ultra high net worth individuals, and also acting as an executive governance in syndications. So I take on a couple clients a year who are syndicators and pretty much come on to them as kind of as chairman of the board or on their board to help them with their governance and also bring even more credibility and expertise in what they're doing with regards to raising capital and acquiring properties. And obviously, I'm extremely advanced and very, very deep into technology with regards to multifamily. So anything that's big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and finally blockchain. So that's who I am. I'm only 34. I haven't slept for probably the last 10 years. So that's how I kind of got around to doing all that stuff. So to get this going on, I wanted to start off, and I think you guys will appreciate this. That's kind of why I talked about being an Olympic human performance coach and having studied initially in biomechanics. An injured LeBron James or an injured Peyton Manning or an injured Sidney Crosby, these guys, these athletes, cannot win a championship, cannot perform if they're injured, right? So if let's say we take a Sidney Crosby, who's the best player arguably in the NHL for the last 10 years. Now, if Sidney Crosby was unable to play half of the games each season and was unable to play in the playoffs because he's injured, well, he wouldn't be the best player in the world. Or he would, but he wouldn't win championships and he wouldn't win scoring titles and he wouldn't be able to do any of that stuff. Now, the first thing that I used to do with Olympic level athletes and professional athletes was, number one, instead of focus on building power and making them stronger and faster, which most strength coaches and trainers and human performance coaches do, I would focus initially on injury prevention, because most athletes initially have more than enough speed and power. They're not even actually using it all. And anyway, if they're injured, what's the point, right? And another analogy that can be quite interesting to help you guys understand where I'm going with this is you can have a car with, say, 650 horsepower, but if you can't convert that power to the wheels because you don't have proper transmission and your tires are not the right tires, then you won't be able to get off the ground and you won't be able to use that horsepower and that torque to actually go fast. And the same thing reverts to multifamily real estate investing. So, I mean, we're all here focusing on growth. If you look at all the seminars out there, all the gurus, all the coaches, all the articles, all the websites, and I'm not trying to bash on anyone, but everyone's talking about growth. Everyone's talking about more profit, buying low, making profit when you buy, value add, increasing rents, decreasing expenses, increase in IRR. And, we're all talking about growth. And I'm, as an entrepreneur, that's one of the first things that obviously that I think of also, because I think there's a part of us where we're sharks, we're investors, we're entrepreneurs, and we live and we breathe by advancing, and we want to grow and we need to grow. It's something that's stronger than all of us. And the whole point, obviously, is to grow your portfolio, grow your net worth, and grow your cash flow. That's what you want to do as a real estate investor. Now, the problem with that is that if you only focus on growth, eventually what's going to happen is you will be unable to manage your growth. And the second thing is that growth is not linear. Now, we as human beings like to simplify things. It comes naturally. It's actually part of our brain structure. That's what kind of allows us to deal with so much shit and deal with so much stress and deal with all the input that's coming from our environment, is that our brains kind of just focus on certain things, certain patterns, and help us simplify things in order to not be overwhelmed daily by all the input and information that we're receiving. The problem with that is obviously in this case, as real estate investors, we're focusing on growth and we're forgetting the fact that growth in a portfolio, growth in investing, growth in a company is never linear. It's actually a very jagged line if you're looking at a temporal line over time, and it's kind of roller coaster like. And on top of that, when you consider that you're investing in a multifamily real estate property that is actually kind of victim to the market that it's in and the market cycles, on top of the higher, more macro level market cycles, then you realize that it's even less linear than you think. But obviously, with cash flow, Excel sheets, and crunchers, or all these deal analysis things, we've kind of been taught and habitualized to look at it as just linear exponential growth, which in reality is total bullshit. Because for anyone who's been in the market for more than 5 or 10 or 15 years, and who's actually studied the markets and who has actually transacted and dealt with properties, you quickly realize, or if hopefully you remember that nothing is linear and nothing is stable, and nothing simply just goes up all the time. So knowing that, we want to focus on not simply going for growth and building our portfolios. We want to focus on injury prevention, kind of like LeBron. An injured LeBron can't win championships. And if you lose all your money, or if you go bankrupt, or you lose your property, or you lose your investors, or you lose your reputation, say if you're a syndicator or a GP or a KP, well, then everything's out the window. It all goes pretty much to shit at that point. And no matter how much growth you manage to get and how much performance you manage to generate in the past 5, 10, 15, 25 years, it can all be gone within a matter of months, within a matter of years. Or you could also, in a scenario that is not as extreme, say you don't lose everything, but you could also annul all the past performance that you had. So that's another big problem, because I mean, if you're beating the market over the last 10 years, but then for the next 5 years you get destroyed by the market and are performing under market, well, then you might simply cancel all the past performance that you had, if we're looking at things over a 10, 15-year time period and averaging everything out. So risk is one of the most crucial components leading to your investment success. And contrary to popular belief, multifamily real estate does have risk in it. It's not a risk-free investment or asset class. Therefore, we need to be able to learn how to manage and mitigate and deal with risk, and actually use risk as something that will, at the end, actually help us grow even more and have even more performance and generate what stock investors would call alpha. So the whole point being, though, you have to make sure that you're not taking unbelievable risk or exceptional risk, or taking risk without actually knowing that you're taking risk. That's also a major problem that I see. One way to explain that is, say, I see sometimes syndicators or GPs say that they're generating X percent of return on investment or internal rate of return, and that they're doing better than every other syndicator. And then you kind of look at their deal structure and look at what they're doing, and you realize that, wow, these guys are taking on probably 3 times more risk. And so if you adjust their returns based on risk, are they generating 3 times more returns? No, they're not. So you really have to keep that into consideration, especially as right now, most cycle experts, myself included, feel that we are pretty advanced in the market cycle, especially in the expansion phase, or depending on how you want to call it or which model you use. Obviously, there's the 4-stage cycle phase that Dr. Mueller uses out of the University of Denver. I know a lot of people studied under him. I've also studied quite a bit under that methodology. I try and kind of dumb it down to the boom, slump, and recovery phases. That way you kind of have a 3-pronged phase attack, but they all work fine. So right now I think that we are truly at the end of the boom phase. We've probably been at the end of it for a little while, and logically the next phase will be the slump phase or the contraction phase, or in really bad cases, the crash phase. Hopefully we won't. I know a lot of people, and the point today is not necessarily to give you a course on market cycles or whatnot, which could be a whole other, couple-day course or presentation. But ultimately, market cycles are actually quite predictable. It's quite easy and scientific to predict that right now we are in, say, the boom phase or the expansion phase, depending on what you call it, and that the next phase will effectively be a slump or a contraction. Now, what's not predictable is when that's going to happen and the intensity of that transition. So that's kind of why we have to manage risk, because if we knew when it would happen and we knew what intensity it would be, well, there wouldn't be any risk. So, so that's actually what kind of makes it interesting. Now, next slide. I'm trying to make this as interesting as possible right now without going into too much data. Jay-Z versus Toucan Sam. So the whole point here is, I'm sure you're all wondering, what the hell is this guy talking about, Jay-Z and Toucan Sam? Well, Toucan Sam obviously is probably better at repeating stuff, being that he's in the family of parrots. When you look at market cycles and you look at the transitions between the different phases, what we generally like to say, especially in the economist world, is that market cycles don't repeat themselves, but they all rhyme. So market cycles are not like Toucan and Sam. They're not like parrots. They don't repeat themselves. And that's why they're so complex, and that's why it's easy to get fooled by the various market cycles and the various phases in each of those cycles. But we can predict the movement of those phases through of those cycles through the various phases, because market cycles do rhyme, kind of like your favorite rapper Jay-Z or whoever your favorite rapper is right now. So if we look at a history of market cycles, just briefly, ultimately, going as far back as the 1700s, what we can see is that the earliest recorded uses in history of the word bubble actually kind of started with the South Sea bubble. So the South Sea bubble, what it was the South Sea Company, which was a joint stock company founded in England in 1709 or 1710, around those years, which was quite a while ago. And ultimately what it did was it issued shares to the public, and then less than a year in, it increased its stock market value tenfold. So we're talking about back in Great Britain or England or whatever the hell it was called back then. So they even had problems back then, even though now they're dealing with Brexit. So things haven't really changed much for them. A short time later, its stock price had dropped back to close to the original listing price, and that crash, which was, I guess, probably one of the first crashes registered, created a drop in value that was around 90%. So obviously, fortunes were made and fortunes were lost during that time. And eventually, despite that huge devaluation, the South Sea Company, actually took over responsibility of the debt of the government of the United Kingdom. So today we kind of call that the bubble company. And as it was known, or as it's known today, the bubble company was actually kind of based off another company called the Banque Royale, or in English, the Royal Bank. Obviously, it's not the same thing as the Royal Bank of Canada. We're talking about the Banque Royale, which was a company in France in the 1700s, which also was organized as a joint stock company used to actually finance government debt. So of these companies, this all kind of brought into, eventually in the UK, brought in something called the Bubble Act in order to control them. And we have other examples of various bubbles. One popular one that we talk about a lot is the tulip bubble, which was the tulip, I guess, bulb mania in the Netherlands or in Holland. I can't can't remember which years that was. I think it was in the 1600s actually. And ever since we've had quite a long history of bubbles and market cycles, and we can start charting them back pretty far. And unfortunately, economic theory doesn't really do very well at providing explanations, uh, since bubbles don't readily allow the analysis or using advanced mathematics. But we can see patterns and we can follow them. And the important thing to understand here is that uh, you know what makes bubbles predictable is actually it has nothing to do with mathematics, which kind of pains me to say that, being a math guy, but it's all based on psychology. Ultimately, it's based on human psychology, and that's true in the multifamily space. That's true in the stock market. That's true in the macroeconomy. So it's all based on psychology, on human psychology, and we hear. You can see the signs a lot. Like right now, you hear a lot of people saying, "Well, this time it's different." That's a telltale tail sign that we are at the end of a boom phase or an expansion phase, or things aren't the same this time, or there's still capital in the market. People are going to continue on buying, whatnot. These are all kind of signs, and when you start hearing these signs, it's important to start kind of becoming a little bit skeptical about what's going to happen. Now, one thing that I see a lot of people make a mistake doing with regards to when we're in this part of the market cycle is either people kind of fall into the dangerous place of saying, well, this time it's different and the market's going to keep on going up. Obviously, those people are kind of, they'll be shit out of luck when things start to go down, especially if they're using a lot of leverage, if they're using expensive capital, and they're promising, high returns to their investors or to themselves or to whomever. The other people that are making a major mistake are the people that are just not buying anything. And that's a huge mistake, because the point of the matter is that as a real estate investor, you need to be investing. So if you spend more than a couple of years not investing, or even more than a year actually not investing, you're no longer a real estate investor. So you either become simply you simply become a landlord, or you simply become a real estate speculator. So either one, but you're not an investor. An investor has to keep on investing. You have to keep on generating returns. You have to stay active in the market, because obviously the market is not just math, it's not just properties, and it's also not just psychology. It's also relationships, especially in the asset class that is multifamily. The number one example I give, I have a friend who is a very smart person in the multifamily industry, and hasn't been buying properties for the last couple of years because he's convinced the market's going to drop, which, I agree. I think the market's going to drop also. But like I said earlier, we don't know when, and we don't know by how much. So what happens if it only drops in 3 years and it only drops by a couple percent? Well, then you're kind of shit out of luck. You've missed all those years of investing because you were afraid of something that was going to potentially happen, rather than investing knowing that that's going to potentially happen, and putting in safeguards and putting in various safety nets in order to make sure that it doesn't hurt you too much. Because if the market does drop, when the market does drop, and by how much, you want to make sure that you're also prepared at that moment to then kind of like a lion jump on the prey, because in a slump phase, in a contraction phase, what's going to happen, or what always happens, is that a lot of people end up in a very bad position. Now, who jumps on those people or on those opportunities or on those properties and then profits from the slump phase that then goes to the recovery phase, and then eventually the expansion phase? Who profits from all that potential appreciation through the market, which is pretty much free appreciation if you learn how to read market cycles and learn how to do risk management like we're doing today? Well, then you can really generate alpha and generate some awesome returns. And but if you want to have opportunities and have access to that stuff, well, you have to stay in the market. Because if you haven't bought anything for the last 3 or 4 years, when a property does come onto the market in a slump phase, and it's a really great deal, and there's a lot of capital appreciation possible over the next 5-10 years because the market's going to start to recover after that, well, the broker or the agent who has that property will not present that to you. He's going to present it to one of his buyers or one of his investors who has actually been active over the last couple of years, because it's just basic humanity at that point. It's basic human relationships. It's basic networking. And the person who would have been active in the last couple of years will have a lot more mind share in the minds of those agents and brokers and sellers who have access, or wholesalers and bird dogs who have access to all these great deals. So it's important to understand that and not fall into a phase of complacency if you think everything's going to keep on growing, or fall into a phase of latency if you think that everything's going to go to shit and that you're just going to stop buying for the next couple of years. So ultimately what that brings me to understand is that price is a personal metric. So, we're talking a lot about cap rates, and well, this market should be trading at this cap rate, and that one should be trading at this cap rate, or you should purchase property under market value and make profit upon purchase, and we kind of hear all these real estate, what I call real estate platitudes, because realistically they are platitudes and they're not really based on much science or hard evidence. The reality of it in a free market, like the multifamily real estate market of offer and demand, price is truly a personal metric. The price of a property and the value of the property, at the moment we have no way of truly establishing value of a property scientifically. The CAPM measurement, which is used a lot more in the stock market, doesn't apply to multifamily real estate. Even determining the discount rate in a normal DCF, in a discounted cash flow analysis, or a DCF Excel analysis, it is a pretty hard thing to do. Even determining risk and the risk rate in cap rates is also a very hard thing to do. I have yet to see anyone be able to do it, and I've read pretty much all the research on this and spoken to all the great minds in this area, in the theoretical real estate and academic field. So price and value, truly in multifamily, is a question of a personal investor profile. Real estate finance is all about risk and opportunity. I think that's extremely important to remember. And there's never opportunity without risk. And the value of a property is fundamentally an assessment of the associated risks and opportunities. And those associated risks and opportunities have to do with the property itself, and also have to do with you as an investor. Because obviously, say at the moment, if me and say Dan are competing for the same property, and the property is for sale, let's say for a couple $1 million, and Dan, in order to be able to purchase the property, has to syndicate and has to raise money from LPs, and is ultimately pretty much paying a 12 to 15% IRR on that money that he's raising. Well, that if you're looking at the weighted average cost of capital, what we call the WACC, that's expensive capital. So if on the other side, I am a high net worth individual worth say $10 million US and more, and I'm the one purchasing the property, or I'm working for a high net worth individual purchasing the property for him and him or her, and the expected return on investment is say 5.5 to 7%. Well, I will be able to make that transaction at a higher purchase price than Dan will be able to make that transaction. And let's face it, the risk won't be as high for me either, because even if I do say overpay it with regards to overall market sentiment and various market reports, the fact of the matter is that I'm a high net worth individual. I'm probably not very leveraged. I'm not looking for that much return on investment. I have sufficient cash reserves in various forms, so that if the market does take a shit, well, you know what? I have the banking relationships, I have also capital relationships, and I actually have capital to weather that storm and kind of ride myself out of that market and probably still generate, an overall IRR. If you look at it over 5-10 years, that is directly in goal with what I wanted. So price and value is not only dependent on properties, but it's dependent on yourself as an investor, on your profile, on your investor profile, and on the profile of the capital that you're using, depending on how much debt versus actual equity or quasi-equity that you're using, and what's the cost of all of that, and also what's the patience of all of that. So that's really important. Now, all this, obviously is a big primer, and is I understand is actually quite theoretical and philosophical. But I think multifamily real estate, philosophy is very, very important, because it's our investment philosophy that then allows us to develop strategies that will help us perform and succeed, independent of which phase of the cycle that we're in, or the duration of a cycle, or the intensity of the cycle, or which cycle we happen to be in, or through various cycles. Now, the real risks, if you really boil it down to multifamily real estate, the real risks, ultimately, there's three of them. It's negative annual cash flow, recapitalization upon refinancing, and loss of capital upon disposition. Now, just give me 1 second. I want to make sure that I'm not going to overrun my presentation here, so I just want to make sure I actually have the time in front of me so I can time myself. But the first real risk, obviously, is negative annual cash flow, because it's important, and it's a big misnomer in real estate. We talk about cash flow, but cash flow is not only cash flow what you get this year out of your apartment and next year out of your apartment. In a pure finance sense, cash flow, cash flows which are used to establish internal rate of return, so IRR, and NPV, net present value. Cash flows can actually be negative, and cash flows are actually an ensemble of various positive and negative cash flows over different years. So at this moment, what we're really talking about, the real risk for people listening or watching, is negative annual cash flow. Buying a property this year, and say the property is generating $100,000 of in rents, and it costs you $50,000 to operate the property, paying for various taxes and paying for, say, heating and electricity or water and maintenance and all those various expenses. And then obviously you have to pay off your debt, so you have to service debt. And let's say that debt also costs $60,000 because you're really leveraged and you have expensive debt. Well, then you're going to have a property that's cash flowing annually a negative $10,000. Now, that's something that can be and in fact is very risky, especially in the case of saying the example that I used earlier of when you buy a property, say that is at a bit higher valuation than what would be considered median or mean valuation or average market value, or even economic value. For those of you who have not done much financing or have not worked as bankers or investment bankers or financiers, economic value is kind of a hidden value that bankers don't tell multifamily investors about. And what it is it's an actualized value, a capitalized value. Sorry, actualized is actually in French. So it's a capitalized value based on an ability to service debt and based on a loan-to-value ratio. So using NOI, using LTV, and using DCR, and that's something that I teach in financial engineering. You can establish something called economic value. So what is the value that the bank is actually putting on the property? Because when the bank says that they're borrowing you, say, up to 75%, well, that's usually up to 75% of the smallest of the values between actual price that you're paying, so market value, and economic value, which is a financial calculation. Now, a lot of people might say that, well, my maximum loan amount or maximum loan dollars was limited due to either LTV or DCR. Well, what they're pretty much saying is that economic value was actually lower than market value. It's just that you don't know, or they don't know, that that's economic value. So that's a big risk. Buying high LTV and or buying with a low DCR, because if you're buying, say, at a 1.15 DCR and the market turns on you and interest rates rise, well, then you can really be in a bad situation. So as long as you're you have a positive cash flow, or that you have sufficient reserves to deal with your cash flow, whether it be positive or negative, then you're fine. So you can manage that risk. So it's important to always, 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 always be aware and up to date on what your DCF is of each property you own and of the overall portfolio that you own. That is key. It's a KPI, a key performance indicator, or a key performance metric that you should be aware of at all time. Every week, every month, you should know. If I asked you, or one of your investors asked you, or your broker, your banker asked you, what's your DCR actually on your property, or on all of your properties, and what's the overall DCR of your portfolio, you should have that answer. That's one way of managing risk. And you should also be projecting, by doing stress testing, what will be your DCR, say, upon refi in 2 or 3 or 4 years, if, for example, the interest rates have risen by X percent or X basis points. So that's really one of the simplest ways to manage risk and reduce risk, especially in the market that we're in right now, is to be very conscientious about your DCR and DCRs. The second thing is to be very conscientious about your EV, so your economic values, like I was talking about earlier. Because let's take the example, you don't increase rent enough, so your NOI doesn't increase enough, and you took a 5-year term on a mortgage, and within those 5 years, the interest rate increases by, say, 100 basis points, so 1%. And even worse, the DCR necessary for the maximum loan dollars has increased. So say you finance and you purchase a property with an institution that accepted a 1.20 DCR, and therefore based the maximum loan dollars on that 1.20 DCR and say a 3.5 interest rate. Well, if in 5 years the interest rate is now 4.5 and the only bank that you can manage to finance with demands that the DCR be at 1.3, well, what might happen is that when you first bought the property, let's say it was $1 million property, you managed to get a $750,000 loan on that. And upon refinancing in 5 years, if you haven't increased rents and NOI enough and haven't moved that needle upwards, and you're now refinancing with another bank that demands higher DCR and interest rates have gone up, maybe the maximum loan dollars that bank or any bank will be willing to give you, let's say, might only be $690,000. So initially you had a $750,000 loan. If that loan didn't capitalize it fast enough within the 5 years, especially if you took only an interest-only loan, then you're really fucked. Well, then you might actually have, say, on that initial loan of 750 in 5 years, there may be still, 705 left on it. Now, if the new maximum loan that you can get on refi is only 690, well, guess what? You're going to have to recapitalize $15,000, meaning that 5 years after owning the property and managing it, you're going to have to inject another down payment, a second down payment of $15,000 in order to recapitalize the loan. Or else, what might also happen, what various banks and institutions will do, they'll allow you not to do that, but you'll have a higher interest rate because of the excess risk in their books. So that's why it's important to understand capital markets and financing. So that's a really dangerous thing, is managing not only DCR annually and managing what your EBITDA is, so what your profit and loss statement looks like, but also managing the risk with regards to financing. Now, obviously, in times like these where interest rates rise, and we all kind of think that we're at the end of a boom market or an expansion market, one of the simplest ways to mitigate risk with regards to financing is to take longer terms, to lock in, 10, 20, 30-year term mortgages. Now, the problem with that is that eventually kind of shuts down or impedes any potential leverage that you could pull out of these properties upon refinancing to continue buying other properties. So you have to use that in an intelligent way. Finally, the third thing is loss of capital upon disposition. So actually purchasing, say, a property for $1 million, 5 years down the road, you have to sell the property. Unfortunately, cap rates within that time expanded and now are higher, and therefore your property is no longer worth $1 million, it's worth 950. So you're losing $50,000 on that transaction. That's obviously a big danger, especially through market cycles. That's why usually people will say that they want to do buy and hold. That way they think that that's their way of mitigating that risk. I don't think it is the way of mitigating that risk. I think that's an oversimplification of the markets. I think that's also falling into the one strategy trap. I spoke about this. I actually wrote about this on my Facebook page lately in the last couple of weeks about how we must have an overall investment philosophy as multifamily investors, and therefore that core philosophy then allows us to use various strategies depending on the times of the markets and the phases. And I think buy and hold is ultimately just a strategy, and you don't want to fall into the trap of being a one strategy pony and only use that one strategy, because then you'll miss out on a lot of potential gains and a lot of potential leverage and actually generating alpha and beating the market. So at that point, buy and hold is not simply the way to reduce the risk with regards to loss of capital upon disposition. The way to do that is actually to actively manage your portfolio and each property financially by always knowing what your DCR is, what your LTV is, and projecting your DCRs and your LTVs, and projecting cap rates, and projecting also economic value and interest rates, and also your access to capital, and not to forget also CapEx. So what type of renovations and value you're going to have to add into the property over the years. So that's extremely important. So the loss of capital upon disposition is what I call MV risk, so market value risk. So ultimately, these three risks are what we want to protect against: DCR risk, economic value risk, EV risk, and market value risk, MV risk. How we're going to do that, or how we do that, ultimately, is initially through quantitative risk mitigation. So equity structure, debt structure, weighted average cost of capital, so WACC, and time frames. So using time. So I'm not gonna go too far into this, because I know that I'm actually me myself limited in time with regards to this presentation. But ultimately, the way we're going to mitigate risk through all this, in a quantitative sense, is our equity structure and our debt structure. So our capital stack. How are we playing with our capital stack in order to mitigate risk? Obviously, the logical thing to do would be to either use if you're going to use more debt in your capital structure than equity, then you want to use very long-term debt that you can control, debt that doesn't have many surprises. So that's why we were talking about, say, 10, 20, 30-year term debt, rather than having to refinance in 5 years and putting yourself out there and possibly ending up, when the music stops playing, with no chair. And also, the other way to mitigate risk is through your equity structure. So more equity you have, also you have less risk debt-wise, and you have also more power to generate alpha through the slump phase, and then the subsequent reprise after the slump phase. And also, one has to understand that risk mitigation quantitatively can come through weighted average cost of capital, because yes, you can play with equity and debt structures and play with your LTVs and your DCRs, but like I said at the beginning of this presentation, the cost of your equity and your debt and your overall cost of that, the blended cost, so the WACC, has a big impact on what you're doing. If at the moment everyone's buying at a 5 cap rate and everyone's paying a WACC of, say, 9%, and you're able, for various reasons, because you've raised equity and debt from even better sources, and your WACC at the moment is 5%, and you're purchasing those same properties at the same cap rate, well, then obviously versus the rest of the market, you're a lot less exposed when the market does transition into a different phase and people start having trouble. You'll be in a pretty good position at that point. And finally, the fourth way to mitigate risk in a quantitative fashion is through time management. So pretty much time frames. So the term of debt, the term of equity also. Let's say you're raising capital through LPs, and that capital has to go back to them within 3 to 5 years, that's really not the same thing as having LPs who are willing to actually stay put and not move around their capital for the next 10 years, which gives you a lot more leeway to deal with risk and with transitions in the phases in the market cycle. Obviously, interest only or not, amortization length, and conversion. So what I mean by that is interest only or not. I know a lot of people are talking about that as something very risky at the moment, and I agree that at the moment, say having a 3-year IO or a 5-year IO is very risky because we don't know where we're going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years. Absolutely. Now, if you could get a 7 to 10-year IO, that'd be absolutely phenomenal, and that'd be a great way of mitigating risk quantitatively. And the other thing is on your equity side. I mean, if you're managing to raise equity or quasi equity, which is practically debt from equity investors, with, for example, an interest only for 7 to 10 years, then that's a great risk mitigation tool right now. Amortization length, same thing. So if we're talking about quasi equity or even debt or whatnot, the longer you get that amortization period, the less your DCR is, and that way you can help manage your DCR even in a better way. And conversion. So what happens to that debt or that equity or that quasi equity upon maturity? If we look at VTB, so vendor takebacks, which are pretty much vendor financing. So when a seller, say you buy a property for $1 million, you put down 150, you get 750 in bank financing, and you get another $100,000 from the seller who stays in as a second lien on the property with a mortgage. We call that a VTB, a vendor takeback. Well, if that VTB upon maturity in 5 years, let's say, if there's a possibility of converting it into equity rather than that seller foreclosing on you if you're not able to pay back the VTB, well, then that's also a great way of mitigating risk. Also, qualitative and geographical risk mitigation. So I'd say that what I'd be doing if I was you right now with many properties, and what I do with my clients is we mitigate risks through qualitative aspects of properties. So if you only buy C properties, it might be time to start thinking about buying maybe Class B or Class A properties, even though, yes, you think they are more expensive. They are not really more expensive, even though they have maybe a lower cap rate, because you have to understand that in the cap rate, there's a portion of risk that is already calculated in it. And if you adjust for risk, therefore your B is not necessarily more expensive. It's just that the less risk is already priced into it. So that might be a way also of mitigating risk is if you only bought A properties, it might be time to buy B and C properties, and vice versa. And the other thing is geographically, if you're only buying properties, say in tertiary markets, it might be time to think about buying properties in secondary and primary markets, and also vice versa. If you only buy in primary markets, it might be time to think about maybe diversifying and mitigating risk through smaller markets. And this can be done in a two-pronged approach. You can do qualitative and geographical at the same time. So say someone who only buys Class A properties in Miami and Tampa Bay, well, that person might think about buying maybe B and C properties, not only in Miami and Tampa Bay, but also possibly buying B and C properties in smaller cities, say like Tallahassee or Pensacola or Jacksonville, or even maybe buying A properties in those places. So that way you can mitigate risk in a different approach. Qualitative continued, I'd say that if we continue with a qualitative approach, if you have currently 100 units and they're all 2-bedroom units, well, then a great way to manage risk, especially in this type of market, is to start thinking about possibly selling some of those units or buying more, but buying 3 bedrooms, 1 bedrooms, and start dispersing a bit more the way or the dispositions of your entire unit base, and therefore you have access to a different type of clientele, and that clientele won't be affected in the same way if we enter a recession, or when we enter a recession, or when we enter a softer market. Obviously, a 1-bedroom has a potential for higher rotation, but sometimes also higher rent growth, or is even a more stable product in a recession with regards or compared to, say, a 3-bedroom apartment. Things like also all-inclusive or non-inclusive, as the economy tanks, people want to have less and less bills. So if you have a property that is all included, say you include Netflix and you include internet and you include heating and lighting and all that stuff, well then during bad times, that property, although it might be less profitable and generating less cash flow in markets like we are right now, well, when that market does turn around and goes into contraction, that property might actually be a lot more stable, and your vacancy rates will not be as heavily affected, and neither will your rents. And finally, if we look at the humanistic risk management factor, something that not enough people talk about, the whole point is that as a real estate investor, you are also an entrepreneur, a real estate investment entrepreneur, or a realpreneur, as I like to call it. Well, there's also a humanistic side of these things, because we can't forget that our tenants are ultimately our clients. Just the same way that if you were a restaurant operator, the people that come and eat food in your restaurant are your clients. And ultimately, someone who even pays a small rent of $500 a year, which amounts to $500 a month, which amounts to $6,000 a year, that's an important client. You know, if you own a restaurant, someone spends $5,000 to $10,000 a year in your restaurant. I mean, you're going to treat them awesomely, and maybe when they do start to have trouble financially during a recession, you might also give them some concessions or help them out or do certain things. And some owners that I've seen succeed in really shitty markets have been very, very strong on this humanistic side of things. Building various community outreach programs during recessions for their own tenants. Because let's face it, if your tenant loses their job or gets a pay cut, and they're not able to pay for their rent anymore, and they have to move and go into a smaller place or a cheaper place or a less quality place, the fact of the matter is that tenant really doesn't want that, and you probably don't really want that either, because you're going to have trouble finding another tenant to pay the same price. So there might be a way in that moment, some creative ways to say, hey, you might even become a creditor to the tenant and say, look, I understand that you have had a pay cut and we're going through a recession and whatnot, and I know it can be difficult, and you might be thinking about looking at another place because you want to pay, say, $125 less a month or $100 less a month or whatnot. What if I propose this to you? Maybe you could pay $75 less a month, but I'll give it to you as a loan. And say let's do this for the next year and see how it goes, and then starting in a year and a half, well, then you can start repaying me, and we'll actually do a side contract based on that. We'll do a loan. So I mean, there are various laws that you have to be careful of. So make sure you talk to your attorney. And make sure you watch out for federal and state laws. But there are various things that you can do to also mitigate risk. And yes, your cash flow might not be as good, and the performance of your property might not be as good, but it won't be as bad either as it could be, which is also a way of mitigating risk. And then you'll be in a better position to attack once things go back up. Further solutions, quickly. LP communications and expectations. If you're a syndicator, I think communication is key, and I think too many syndicators are promising too many things and not communicating things well enough. So you must communicate to your LPs, even though I know that you're afraid that you might lose them, or that they might not want to invest, or that they might want to pull their capital out. You have to communicate to them what your philosophy is, why you're using various strategies at the moment, where we are in the market cycle, and maybe even promise them a bit less and lower expectations with regards to returns, or make expectations a bit more patient and understanding, so that that you have a better position to go through a slower market or a less solid market. Risk-adjusted IRR, I see, once again, we talked about it earlier. If you're competing with other syndicators and the other syndicators are offering 15% IRR, well, make sure you look at what type of properties they're buying and communicate that to your potential LPs and say, look, I'm offering 12, but I'm taking a lot less risk, and I won't lose your money. Whereas the other guy is maybe generating 3% more, but you might lose your capital, or you might only generate 4% because the distribution of probability is a lot larger. Cash reserves, negative cash flow as a down payment. Depending on how much leverage you're using when you buy a property, one might see the cash flow of the first couple of years, which is negative. Well, you might simply just annul that and kind of look at it as zero and say that, well, I kind of calculate that in my down payment. So say if I put $100,000 down payment instead of $200,000, but because of that I'm higher leverage, and therefore my cash flow in the next 5 years will be negative $10,000. That I might still have that $200,000 right now, but it allows me not to use the whole 200, only use 100, and then only have to pay out, say, 20 a year. And over the 5 years, yes, I put in the 200, but I was also able to kind of keep some cash and keep it in protected. So that's also a way of managing risk. Value add obviously is an easy one that everyone talks about. The problem with value add is that in a slowing market, there might be no more value to add because renters and tenants can't pay for it. Your capital pool, making sure you have a really strong capital pool, growing that capital pool consistently, even if you don't need it, both on the LP side and the quasi-equity side, through LPs and through hard money lenders and various private lenders, I think is essential to mitigating risk. If you need $1 million for the next 2 years, make sure you have $2 million. And it could be under the form of kind of like a credit line with various passive investors. Hey, that's fine at that point. And finally, lending relationships are essential so that when a crisis does hit, if it does hit, you have such strong lending relationships with your bankers and your financiers and your investors that they are able to kind of help you get out of that storm and even profit off of the incoming storm. So I think I'm exactly at an hour and 2 minutes. I don't know if Dan's there.
Yep, I'm here.
We do my best to stay within it.
No, you're great. You're great. We have about 15 minutes to do some questions and answers if you got a few more minutes. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to simply start off by finishing this presentation here, or?
Yeah, finish this presentation, then I have a few questions that I already have teed up for you, and then we'll jump right into those.
All right. So really quickly, I said I'd talk about a bit more what I'm doing. So the MREX Multifamily Real Estate Exchange is coming to the U.S. this year. So you can see here on the timeline, we're actually entering Florida with the Multifamily Real Estate Week, which is a almost a week long. It's actually 4 days of events geared towards multifamily real estate with various themes. So it's very high quality. There's something for everyone, for people with even 1,500 units, or even people who have not started investing in multifamily. So we'll be in Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, St. Pete, and Miami in April. We'll be in Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville in June. You can see the dates there, and the Northeast in July. And in 2019, the College of the MREX will be entering the U.S. with our programs that we already have here in Canada. So our Certificate in Multifamily Real Estate Financial Engineering, Certificate in Multifamily Real Estate Entrepreneurship, and our 6-month diploma program in multifamily real estate investing, which we kind of nickname the Wolf Pack because it's only limited to 30 people. You can also, most of my stuff is in French. I'm coming to the U.S. now, as I've spoken many times in the U.S. in the last couple of years. So starting, I believe, next week on YouTube, youtube.com/MREX Real Estate, I will be producing a show called Realpreneur Principles, where I talk mostly about being a CEO of your real estate investment company. So it's extremely high value. Even if you're a small investor, even if you're a syndicator or a fund manager, it's really acts towards building your multifamily real estate investment business. And you can follow me, join me on my Facebook. I have a couple Facebook pages and profiles, so make sure you join the right one, facebook.com/The Real Nikolai Ray, or also on LinkedIn and Instagram. So I hope that everyone appreciated the presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
No, that was very helpful, very content-packed, and I already have a lot of things that I've learned myself through it. I'm going to go ahead and go through some of these questions here, time permitting, and we'll try to get to everyone's. If for some reason we don't get to your question, make sure you go to the MFIN forum and post your question there. I'm sure Nikolai will go over there and answer any questions that you may have after this if we don't get time to answer all of them. The first question here is from Marina, and it says she would like to know where we are in the apartment building market cycle.
I'd say in the overall apartment market cycle, we are probably in the late innings. So the way I see it, I kind of see it like a baseball game, and you know, I know Howard Marks, the prominent stock market investor, also use this analogy a lot. And I think it's very valid that the cycle is very much like a baseball game. So usually baseball has 9 innings, but it can go to 16 to 18 to 22 innings, and we have no idea how long the innings actually last. Uh, you know, Compared to say a hockey game where we know that there's only 3 periods and the periods last 20 minutes, and worst case scenario there's a 5-minute overtime and a shootout and the game's over. With a multifamily real estate cycle, we have no idea how long the innings are and how many innings there are. So knowing that, I think we're at the moment, and according to all my data and research, we're probably at around like the top of the eighth inning, bottom of the eighth inning, somewhere around there, top of the ninth, depending on what we're looking at data wise.
Hopefully we have extra innings.
Exactly. Well, I think we do. Honestly, I think we've actually been probably in extra innings. So I've actually thought we were kind of in the eighth or ninth for the last probably 2 years. So we might actually already be like in the 11th or 12th. But what's important to understand in that is that we're probably at the end of the game. But we don't know how long the innings are going to last and how many extra innings there's going to be. So that's why it's important to not fall into the trap, like I mentioned earlier, of not buying anything and just saying, well, I'm going to wait for the market to turn around, and I'm going to wait for the market to crash or whatnot, or to enter and slump, and then I'll start buying. That's a very dangerous thing. I mean, I've had people both in the U.S. and Canada tell me that. And specifically here in Canada, I'm thinking about one person who in 2013, which was now 6 years ago, telling me that the market was about to crash and go into a slump. So therefore, he wasn't purchasing anything anymore because cap rates were too low. And guess what? Since then, cap rates in say Montreal, where I am, which is the major multifamily market, cap rates have gone from like 5.6 all the way down to like 4.75. And that's despite the fact that interest rates have risen by about 75 basis points. So what's happened to that person is in the last 6 years he hasn't bought jack shit and has generated pretty much zero IRR, and in fact has generated negative IRR because, like most multifamily investors, what they do with their cash and their equity, if they're not investing in multifamily, they don't reinvest it in, say, the stock market or in other asset classes. They kind of keep it in their property as equity, or they keep it in their bank accounts, or maybe in a money market account, which is generating pretty much nothing, or even generating negative returns because of inflation. So that's a very dangerous thing to do.
No, that's a very good point. When you look at IRR, that's probably one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand how it's calculated. But at what IRR is at zero when you return the capital. But when you start to calculate inflation, like you're referring to, that's when it starts to turn into a negative IRR.
Yeah, it's
when you don't invest it.
Cost of opportunity. When you start figuring that in, you're pretty much doing negative 7 to 10% IRR if you didn't buy anything for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. So Devin has another question here about, do you suggest higher down payments to mitigate possible corrections?
Honestly, it's a transaction per transaction basis. Logically, yes. The answer is yes. And, using the Latin saying, ceteris paribus, so all things being equal, I'd say yes. Unfortunately, and if you read one of my posts I wrote maybe a month or two ago on my Facebook page, all things are never equal. So it's kind of dangerous to give an answer like that. I'd say logically, yes, I'd think about it, but it all depends. It depends on the cost of capital that you're working with. It depends on the structure of your capital stack, how much equity versus debt you're using, how much quasi-equity, if you have any in there, what's the terms and the patience and the cost of all that, what's the potential of the property, where is the property, which market it's in. But I would definitely start from it as a basis. Yes, I'd probably use lower LTV if I'm not really sure where the market's going, because if I have lower LTV and I'm paying the same price for a property, well, then my DCR will automatically be higher, and it's a simplistic way of mitigating risk. Absolutely.
Next question is, do you have a template or Excel for calculating those indexes that you talked about, DSCR, et cetera?
Yeah, I do. I have one that we actually built out with my adjunct professor here, who was an actuary. He's an international level actuary for one of the big insurance companies. He specialized in pricing. So we built a very, very honestly, we built an Excel spreadsheet that is probably like none other that exists in multifamily, except for maybe a couple of REITs that might have real estate investment trusts on the stock market that might have something equivalent. It's a very complex thing to use. I give it to the students that we teach to in the certificate and diploma programs in financial engineering, because otherwise it's too complicated and too dangerous to use. Because the problem with spreadsheets and Excel tools and all these various analyzers is that analyzers don't mean jack shit if you don't have the knowledge behind it in order to, number one, make sure that what you're inputting is proper, and number two, that you know how to synthesize and therefore also arrive at various conclusions based on the outputs. So that's extremely important. That's why I don't just sell the spreadsheet or give it out, because for me the spreadsheet is it's like giving a hammer to someone without teaching them how to use or hold a hammer.
Yeah. Next question is, I've been hearing from other investors that A-class assets are in more risk than other classes, B or C. What are your thoughts?
Ceteris paribus. So all things being equal, yes. Unfortunately, all things are not equal, and that's what makes this space so goddamn interesting. And that's why someone like me gets paid so much goddamn money, is because things are not equal, and it's also you have to understand that in multifamily, what makes it so complex, on top of all the things I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, is that we're also dealing with the space market, which is rent, right, and renters, and the buy and demand side of apartment units. But we're also in the property space as investors, living in a buy and demand market on property space. And all that is also dependent on capital formation, therefore capital markets, and obviously the overarching macroeconomy on top of that. So the simplistic guru answer is yes. The real financial engineer, professor, and investor answer is yes and no. So
yeah. Next question is, will a correction really hurt me in the long run if I don't sell, assuming I have reserves?
No. If you have enough reserves and you plan it out and you do everything that we talked about in this presentation, and that you're very conscientious about how you're managing your capital and how you're managing also the intrinsic value of your property, therefore controlling it through NOI and through rents and expenses, and ultimately how you're taking care of your tenants and the people in your team and working around that. No, I don't think you have to sell. Mind you, if you believe that we're at the top of the market, and your property has been maxed out, meaning that you've done as great of a job as possible on increasing rents to the highest the market can take, and that you've decreased expenses to really the bare minimum, then I'd think about selling to profit from that, because obviously you can't get all the equity out by refinancing, and refinancing also brings on different risks. So at that point, I might think about selling if you have the network in place and the confidence in place that when the market does transition into a slump, well, then you'll have access to plenty of opportunities to make that money that you've just pulled out work in that timing.
So last question here is about how many months of operating expenses do you suggest keeping in reserves to mitigate the downturn risk? And would you take this money from distributions and then explain to investors that you are holding the funds for mitigation purposes? And then when would you redistribute those held funds?
Well, I wouldn't look at it in terms of months, kind of like, because I think that's more of like that'd be kind of like what tech startups do with burn rate. And since you're generating cash flows, see, when you're looking at a company, and ultimately a multifamily property, an apartment building is a company, right? It's not just a building, it's a company. And it's valued like the company. So the minute you have a company that actually cash flows and that generates revenues, and that those revenues are fairly predictable, you don't really want to talk about burn rate, and you don't really want to think about burn rate that much. So what I suggest doing is just continually playing with your cash flows in your Excel spreadsheet or whatever tool you use. If you use a more advanced tool, that's fine. Continuously playing with those, stress testing it, and keeping cash flow for, say, your worst case probable situation. Now, how much cash flow that is, that depends on your calculations. It's obviously a building per building basis. I can't answer that question with a direct answer right here at the moment. And for the second part of the question, yeah, I would withhold dividends when I talked about, maybe adjusting investor and LP expectations, and explaining and educating them even more towards where we are in the market, I would do that. Obviously, it's a bit hard to do if you've already promised them something else. But I mean, if you're raising right now and thinking of syndicating a deal, I would definitely put that in there. Saying that, okay, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a 15% IRR. However, there won't be annual cash distributions. Which is subject to me as the fund manager, my own decision. But don't worry, the IRR is cumulative, and so are the cash flows. They're cumulative in any circumstance, right? Yeah. So if you have LPs that really need their cash flow from their investments, then you'll probably lose them, which is probably a good thing because they're probably the weakest LPs that you can have, and the weakest LPs are the most annoying ones during hard times because they're very stressed out and nervous about their money. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It'll just put the onus on you to maybe build up an even stronger investor pool.
I know several of you had some more questions that we weren't able to get to, so make sure you go to the MFIN forum and post those questions there, and go ahead and tag Nikolai on there, and he will do his best to jump on there and answer any of those questions. And if anybody else is on it that can answer them, we'll probably do that as well. So I want to thank you very much, Nikolai, for taking some time out to be here on the summit and speaking, and then really appreciate your presentation. It was very insightful. Do you have any last parting words before you go?
It was truly my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on. The organization, by the way, top notch. I understand how difficult it must be to do this all virtually, but it's truly awesome. Good job, and I think what you're doing is great. And I think my last part to all investors out there is don't fall into platitudes, don't fall into oversimplifications. Understand, respect the market, educate yourselves, become as sophisticated as possible, and be realists.
Well, thank you again, Nikolai. Looking forward to continuing to follow you and maybe trying to make it to some of your events that you're going to have here in the States. And I also noticed that on your timeline, you have the availability to possibly do the MFIN Summit coming up in June. So Absolutely. We'll be talking to you about that as well. So Thank you so much.
Perfect. My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Nikolai.
Bye.
Bye-bye.